BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Next to the issue of nuclear Iran, probably the next biggest issue of concern to the State of Israel is the global movement to delegitimize the State of Israel. And what are we talking about? This originated with the meeting of the UN in Durban, South Africa, which was supposed to talk about racism, and instead the non-governmental organization meeting turned out to be a Israel-bashing session, which was so bad that the Israelis and the United States both pulled out of it. The conclusion was that Israel was a racist apartheid state, and what they've been pursuing since Durban, what we refer to as the Durban Strategy, is what basically came out of their final statement, which was the objective of trying to associate Israel with the image of South Africa. When you think Israel, you think apartheid, just like you think hamburgers with McDonald's, and that the reaction of the world should be the same toward Israel as it ultimately was toward apartheid South Africa. When we talk about BDS, what are the various aspects of what they're trying to do? They're trying to demonize Israel, and they're doing it at every conceivable level. It's not just about politics. They're doing it at the economic level with boycotts. They're doing it at the cultural level with trying to boycott cultural institutions. And it's an ideological campaign, all meant to delegitimize the State of Israel. Again, the key component is to make the false analogy between democratic Israel and apartheid South Africa to isolate and stigmatize the State of Israel. While they are talking about Palestinian rights often, they deny Israel its rights to self-determination, deny Israel the right to self-defense, and tend to blame Israel for all problems in the Middle East. Now, one of the key elements of what we want to do is to separate the legitimate critics of Israel from people who are truly delegitimizers, because all of us probably have our own criticisms of certain Israeli policies. There's nothing wrong with having some critique, but there's a difference. There's a line that gets crossed, and one way to know is legitimate critics talk about the flaws in the hope of improving Israel. We want to see Israel become a better place, whereas the delegitimizers are only interested in embarrassing Israel, isolating it, and making it look as bad as possible. The legitimate critics also see the democratic process in Israel as the means by which you can change those policies that you don't like, whereas delegitimizers try to use non-democratic means to go through other institutions, organizations to try to impose solutions on Israel or policies on Israel that the democratic process wouldn't otherwise accept. Critics want Israel to adopt policies that will help it grow and prosper and bring about peace with the Palestinians and its other neighbors, whereas the delegitimizers are only interested in weakening and ultimately destroying Israel. Legitimate critics, again, want to have a free flow of information. They're willing to have discussions with people on all sides of an issue, whereas the delegitimizers aren't interested in any discussion about Israel that isn't going to paint it in the most hostile light. Now, one of the reasons we know that the delegitimizers have the intention of destroying Israel and are not interested in some peaceful solution is by looking at what the leaders and the founders of the movement actually say. One of the problems we have on the campus is they are able often to give the impression, especially to students who don't have a lot of information, who are very liberal-minded, who want to see peace with the Palestinians, who may object to settlements or occupation. They try to portray the boycott divestment movement as a way to end occupation and bring about peace with the Palestinians, when in fact that's not what their intention is at all, that they talk about a one-state solution and doing away with Israel, not trying to bring about a just solution. Now, what are some of the examples of how delegitimization manifests itself? On campuses and in communities, you have boycotts of Israeli goods. You had the case at Princeton where they were trying to boycott hummus because it was coming from an Israeli company. There are divestment campaigns. Again, this is not only on campus. You had in the state of California an effort to get on the ballot the divestment of pension funds in California from companies doing business with Israel. You have apartheid walls. Again, the effort to try to always combine those terms, Israel and apartheid, at every opportunity. A parade of anti-Israel speakers and panels on college campuses. You know, the apartheid analogy presented in a variety of different ways. You have different kinds of protests against Israeli speakers and activities. Probably the most famous of recent vintage was last year at UC Irvine when you heard about Speaker Ambassador Oren being shouted down by Muslim Student Association students. You have guerrilla theater, where they put up mock checkpoints, for example, or have die-ins. I was speaking at the University of Michigan a couple of years and had to walk through this checkpoint where they were trying to portray Israelis as victimizing Palestinians. Probably the biggest problem, in my view, is not, though, what goes on outside the classroom, it's what goes on inside the classroom. That we found that there are professors on many campuses around the country who use their positions of power and influence to infuse their own political agendas. So one of the ways that we've been trying to combat this through the American-Israeli Cooperative Enterprise is we bring visiting Israeli professors to teach at more than 20 campuses around the country to give students an opportunity to learn from true academics who are giving an objective as possible view of Israeli politics, history, culture. Another part of what the academics are doing is trying to pursue academic boycotts. It's been particularly strong in the United Kingdom, where they actually did pass an academic boycott at one point that was later rescinded, but they continue to try to boycott Israeli universities and certain Israeli professors. This week and next week, Israel Apartheid Week coming to a campus near you. In fact, there are about a dozen that we know of so far, and maybe more around the world. But this is always a focus now of attention every year. Now, what kinds of reasons do we have for opposing BDS? A variety of them. One, to make clear that the BDS movement doesn't recognize Israel and seeks its destruction, that the BDS people apply double standards to Israel, where they only focus on Israeli policy and ignore the policies of other nations or the role of the Palestinians in the conflict. To make clear to people that having a BDS initiative isn't going to change Israel's policy. They're not going to react because a college campus adopts any of these resolutions. They're not going to change their policy. And it also tramples academic freedom by suggesting that the point of view of Israelis shouldn't be accepted on a college campus. It also does nothing to help the Palestinians. You adopt any of these resolutions, the Palestinians will be in no better position than they are today. And even critics of Israel argue that this is a counterproductive approach. What can we do? What can you do on campus? The most important thing is to be proactive, not to wait for the anti-Israel people to act, but for us to act first. And the basic theme I always tell students is what we need to do is beat the drum for Israel. There should be a steady drumbeat every day, week, month, quarter, semester, whatever amount of energy you have to have pro-Israel activities, to set the agenda, to create the image of Israel in a positive way. And it doesn't have to be about politics. It can be film festivals. It can be handing out falafel on the quad. It can be having drum circles. It can be bringing speakers about all different aspects of Israel, the environment, politics, Bible, whatever may be appealing. But the key is to have it going on constantly. And you can do the same thing in the community. Have Israel Peace Weeks, for example. While all these apartheid weeks are going to get lots of attention from people who are afraid the campuses are on fire, there may be a dozen. Last year there were a dozen Israel apartheid weeks and more than 30 Israel peace weeks. This year there may be as many as 50 Israel peace weeks. I think we should have a calendar that the entire Jewish world follows. Just as this month is Black History Month, every month should be something related to Israel. Israel Democracy Month, Israel Human Rights Month, Israel Diversity Month, Israel Film Festival, or Israel Culture Month, so that everybody would know, the JCCs, the CRCs, the campuses, that this month, let's have as our theme activities related to this month's theme. People like to talk about Israel beyond the conflict. It's very good to talk about Yisrael HaYafa, all the great things Israel is doing in medical research, environmental protection, and all the other areas. At the same time, we have to be realistic about it. As long as there is a conflict, you can't get beyond the conflict. Because if Israel announced tomorrow that they discovered the cure for cancer, The people, the detractors would say that's very nice, but why are you killing Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza? So it's very important for the positive agenda, but we shouldn't mislead ourselves to believe that this somehow will solve the problem of delegitimization. Instead of boycotts, we have boycotts. Avi will tell you about Stand With Us sponsoring one of these kinds of activities where we try to get people to buy Israeli products as a counter to the boycotts. Have things like Israel Democracy Days. The most important thing also in being proactive is building relationships. It's not enough to wait until there's a crisis on the campus or in the community and then go and ask all of your friends in other communities to help you if you haven't already established a relationship with them. On the campus, it means being involved in student government or talking to the members of student government and educating them about Israel. Working with the community. Too often the town and the gown are separate. It's important that students understand that the community is out there wanting to help you. And at the same time, the community needs to know what's going on the campus so they know what your needs are. Working with administrations, often communicating with deans, chancellors, provosts, who too often we haven't communicated with or we've ignored, especially until the crisis happens, to make sure we have relationships with them. Ethnic, racial, labor, political, religious groups. We need to have relations with Hispanic groups, with Muslim groups if possible, with African American groups, with Christian groups, college Republicans, college Democrats. Every group that we can make an alliance with, we should, to educate them about our positions. But it can't be a one-way street. We can't just go to a Hispanic group and say, we want you to support Israel and never support anything that they're interested in. We have to be willing also to work with them on some of their issues whenever possible. Progressives, they're the most difficult group now for us to deal with because too often they are going along with the detractors, the delegitimizers, who use the human rights language that appeals to them and misleads them about how to be the best advocate or how to make the best difference in Israel or to make the best difference toward the peace process. We need to be able to speak in their language, and there are some of us who may not be able to. We may have stigmatized being on the right or having certain positions, but there are plenty of people in the Jewish community and in Israel who are liberal progressives. They may oppose settlements, they may oppose occupation, but they support the state of Israel and the legitimacy of Israel, who can talk to them. We need to work with trustees and donors. One of the things I've discovered, I was sort of naive. I thought that universities were interested in education, but what universities really are interested in is money. And so the one thing that can affect them is if you get trustees and donors involved when there's a problem on campus to make sure they let the administrators and the faculty know that certain things go beyond the line. Faculty play an important role. As I mentioned, we bring visiting Israelis to campus. It's important to promote Israel studies on campus, to offer courses that actually give non-political agendas in the classroom, but academic ones. Faculty can be extremely helpful to students who need a mentor or need someone they can turn to when they have questions or when there's a problem in other classes. They're symbols of support. And they can also distinguish between academic freedom and academic malpractice, which happens too often on campuses. What do you do when BDS comes to the community or to a campus? Well, the first thing, to get as much information as you can about whatever the resolution or the divestment petition is, so that we understand exactly what they're up to. Second, and this is one of the most important things, decide if a response is necessary. There are some people in the Jewish community who believe that we have to fight everything. I disagree. I think you have to be strategic. You have to look at whether an issue is really going to be a serious concern or not. Is an apartheid wall something you have to respond to, or do students look at, how do students respond to the apartheid wall? Do they say, oh my God, now I understand those rotten Israelis and what they do to Palestinians, or do most students on that particular campus say, why are these nudniks getting in my way on the way to class? And if the first is the response, then you have one reaction. If the response of students is the latter, you have a different one. Give you one example from this past week. We got alerted to the University of Colorado Regents talking about divestment from Israel. Well, we alerted all the people. We got faculty involved. We started to talk to the community relations people and students. And it turned out that it was this one nudnik who got 2 minutes to speak at the Regents meeting to say that they should divest from Israel. And from all indications, the Regents weren't going to pay any attention to them. And a member of Stand With Us went and spoke for the other side. So decide if a response is necessary, and then you can start to think about what the proper response is. You could contact ACE when something is coming up so that we can activate our network. You can go through our website, stopbds.com. Build a local coalition. As I said from the previous slide, you should have already done that. You should already have it in place, and then you can go to those organizations and ask them for help. Be in contact, as I said, with administrators and trustees. Develop a press strategy. Sometimes, again, it may be better to keep things quiet. That by making it a public issue, you're giving the detractors just the kind of attention they want, and they may go away if you ignore them or if you don't give them publicity. On other occasions, it may be necessary to be very active and aggressive through the press to make our position clear and to distinguish it from theirs. Also, create opportunities for education. Today is a great opportunity for you all to learn. We need other opportunities on campus and off for all of us to learn more about what's going on in Israel. Prepare responses. What are the responses when something comes up? One, know the rules of the game. If the city council or the student government is considering a petition, what are the rules for that being adopted? How do you veto it? How many votes do you need? What are the different parliamentary maneuvers you can use to maybe stop something in its tracks? Let people know the substance. Again, go to stopbds.com or the Jewish Virtual Library, and you can get answers to why apartheid and colonialism are myths when it's applied to Israel, to learn more about Israel's quest for peace and to get that information out, to explain to people the implications of these kinds of BDS movements and how they undermine the peace process, how they create a very toxic environment on campus and divisions that otherwise wouldn't exist. Peaceful campuses suddenly become war grounds or battlegrounds over issues that essentially would be irrelevant to the politics. One thing that we have now as a tool for students is we've circulated a statement to the Jewish organizations in the United States and around the world. Imagine the Jewish community agreeing on something. We actually have 61 organizations from around the world, right to left, conservative, reform, orthodox, liberal, and conservative, all agreeing that BDS crosses a line, that it's counterproductive to the goal of peace, that it's antithetical to freedom of speech, and it undermines the right of the Jewish people to self-determination. So students and communities can take this statement so that when a Jewish student stands up the way they did at Berkeley last year and say, I'm a Jewish student and I represent the Jewish view, you could say, no, you're a Jew, you have a right to your individual opinion, but here's the broad wall-to-wall consensus of the Jewish world that opposes BDS. There's also universities that have made statements, like the University of California, to get statements like this from your university as well, that basically say, we're not going to divest, so forget about it. There's a statement organized by Scholars for Peace in the Middle East of more than 40 Nobel Prize winners, so that you have academic intellectual heavyweights. When you hear Bishop Tutu trotted out as opposing or supporting BDS or supporting boycotts against Israel, you can point to more than 40 Nobel laureates who have a different point of view. Go to stopbds.com. We have all of this information about what to do when BDS comes to town, how to build coalitions, responses to the issues about apartheid or colonialism, factual information, and an opportunity to communicate with us and work with us in the network so that we all are collaborating and working as closely as possible to defeat any effort to delegitimize Israel on the campus or off. Thank you.
Thank you.